If this podcast were to go silent for 30 seconds, what would you do? Would you immediately switch over to another app, say Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, to check what is going on until the podcast came back on air? What about the last time you were on a bus, train, or streetcar? I bet you anything you were on your phone catching up on the news or checking out social media. Think back. When was the last time you just sat on a bench, no phone, no distractions, and tried and solved a problem just by thinking it through? On a recent podcast episode of The Ezra Klein Show, Ezra interviewed acclaimed author Cal Newport about his book titled Deep Work. The book talks about how the digital environment we inhabit is training us out of concentration and into distraction in ways that are bad for our mind, bad for our work, and ultimately, bad for the world. And that is what we're talking about today. So stop multitasking, sit down, and just listen to this episode without any interruptions or distractions. Let's begin your deep workout regime for your mind. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Young PR Pros, a podcast for the young and young at heart PR pros looking for tips and advice on how to build and advance their careers. I am Christine Darbell in Ottawa, Canada.
And I'm Julia Kent in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
I'm Ross Simmons, also in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
And I'm Claire Bonnyman in Toronto, Ontario.
So today, as we had said in the intro, we're talking about an exercise regime. And maybe you do, or maybe you don't have a physical exercise regime. But when you want to get fit, you put time aside in your calendar and you push yourself until you are sweaty and exhausted. Although maybe that's how I work out. I mean, we all work out differently, right? But Cal Newport actually argues that we should be doing the same thing for our brain.
People have the strong perception that we have invented all this amazing technology, and so we're getting so much more done. And one of the great mysteries of this era, if you look at productivity statistics, is no evidence of it. We are seeing less of an increase in productivity than we were in the 70s and we were in the 60s and we were in the 50s. We're in a productivity slowdown, which violates people's intuitions, but is consistent with the story, where we are inventing things that are taking a lot of our time, but aren't actually helping us make big breakthroughs or get our work done in a higher quality way faster.
So, my first question, I guess, is I'm just curious to know how many of you actually have an exercise regime for your brain? How many of you guys actually do deep work? I'm super curious to see if anyone does.
I feel like Ross is going to say yes.
I do. I didn't know that it was called deep work, though. I do it, but I didn't know that it was actually a thing until you sent along this article and I read about it. But I've been doing this for years.
I'm just so not surprised at all that Ross is the one person who has this regime. He just fits it in between flying to Sweden to talk to people and I don't know what else does
selling
Ross
do-rags.
do? Tweet,
Selling do-rags, yes.
Selling do-rags. Sorry, is this a joke I missed?
No, you don't remember. So we've got to go back to I think it's in our anniversary episode when we were talking about our favorite moments. Claire mentioned it's way back, one of the first
I remember
episodes.
this vaguely.
And we were talking about entrepreneurship and how you got into it. And Ross said that the way that he got into entrepreneurship was selling do-rags to his high school friends.
Ross,
True
you
story.
wore a do-rag at one point?
I had braids, cornrows.
Wow, I think we need photo evidence of this.
Agreed.
I think there might be a couple.
Yeah,
on Facebook.
I think Ross in a do-rag needs to go viral as the symbol of entrepreneurial spirit.
From the internet.
Okay, I see. Anyways, moving on to deep work.
So, do you do deep work, Julia?
I do deep work. I am one of those people that is entirely not deep, or entirely completely deep to the point where I won't even answer if you try and speak to me. I do deep work. I don't do exercises for my brain or anything fancy like Ross. maybe I should. I don't know. But writing is really deep work for me. It's one of the reasons I prefer to do writing from home or somewhere where I don't have colleagues, like a Starbucks or something. But yeah, writing is normally deep work for me. I do feel, though, and I think this is entirely the subject of this podcast, that sort of work is kind of dwindling, because even on my MacBook, I get my texts on my MacBook, and I get my Facebook notifications and my Pinterest notifications and just Twitter and everything, right? So it's really hard to just turn off all the noise and really, really, really focus, unless really you're working on pen and paper.
And I can actually attest. So because I used to work with Julia, she would sit at her desk and I would come by and be like, hey, Julia. And I'd have to repeat myself at least twice if she was in deep work and she was writing.
Which is just plain, it's just rude. I know I'm rude.
No, it's probably more rude that I was just showing up unannounced. But anyway, I can attest that Julia actually does deep work when it comes to writing. So
I do. But if I'm not deep working, I am the classic millennial ADD with oh, this tweet, and oh gosh, Beyonce had her twins, and I'm just everywhere. Oh, I got an Instagram notification. So it's one or the other. I don't really have a middle ground.
What about you, Claire? Do you do deep work?
I think I'm with Ross and Julia on this too. I 100% do deep work, but I do find it really hard. I think it even started when I was a kid. My mom used to laugh at me all the time because when I was little, I would pick up a book and I would go around to every member of my family and say, I'm going to go read, do you have anything to say to me? And if they said nothing or whatever, because I would go and ignore them. When I'm focused, I do nothing else. And it happens a lot now with editing, but yeah, it's so hard. I have to use social media blockers and blacklist tools to try and limit what I can do so I can actually get stuff done. But yeah, I find doing, I guess I'll call it deep work now, but sitting and concentrating on one task for a while, especially when for me it's audio editing, it really works, and it's really the best way to get stuff out. But yeah.
What about you, Ross?
Yeah, so I have quite a bit of structure around my deep work, the idea of making intentional time for a focused amount of energy being allocated to a specific task is something that I do. I call it Wired In Wednesday, and it's actually every morning on my Wednesdays. I don't take any calls. I take no meetings. Nobody's allowed to message me and expect a response. I just plug in my headphones, listen to music, and I get a lot of the valuable big things off of my plate done. And that's a focus. It used to be an entire day thing, but over the last, I'd say, few months, I've had to dwindle it down to a half a day. But I plan to kind of ramp that up to be my entire day of execution again. I also have time in my schedule every Thursday and Friday night where I actually ensure that I'm reading books that are challenging. So I make time for that. That's an intentional thing that I do. And I also have deep work as it relates to something that I'm just passionate about, which is learning how to cook great meals. So I make time every Sunday in my calendar to try a new recipe and create a cool new meal that me and my wife can enjoy.
Wow.
So, just wait a minute here, guys.
So you don't just do deep work. You deep life.
Just wait a minute here, guys. I realize you're happily married, Ross, but The Bachelor called and there's 500,000 women already lined up for your season. So
that's so impressive.
I feel like Ross has to have some skeleton in his closet. He's got to be a secret rum runner or something. He's got to have something.
That's true.
He's Mr. Clean.
Wow. I feel so unaccomplished right now.
I know.
No.
I'm I consider myself a pretty high achiever, but Ross just makes me look like a lazy bum.
You can do it
No,
too.
don't worry,
you just
guys.
have to find time in your schedule for deep work.
Deep work.
Well, Christine, you have to follow that.
I was about to say, you guys are all going to feel much better as soon as you hear my response to this question, which is I do zero deep work. I didn't know, I vaguely knew about deep work before I listened to the podcast, but then once I listened to the podcast, I was like, wait a minute, this is a thing? People actually sit down and concentrate and actually do their work without anyone interrupting them? This exists? I wish. That's so awesome. Now, I don't know, and I always lean on the fact that it's because of the industry that I'm in, and it's really hard especially for my job and my position, for me to, let's take your example, Ross, for me to basically say that I'm not going to respond to anything for the first half of every Wednesday would actually be dangerous for my position, because I'm the main media contact. So I theoretically actually have to be checking my email on a regular basis and also responding to my phone or my text messages, because reporters actually text me now. So I find it harder in my particular role, which I think is something that a lot of young professionals and a lot of our listeners, when we talk about deep work, a lot of them, and especially when I was listening to the first half of the episode, I was rolling my eyes a lot, because I was like, there's no way that this actually works. But I think there's to Julia's point, I think there's a way to kind of find that middle ground. And I've actually started to do those little exercise regimes that Cal Newport was talking about. Like, for example, when I'm sitting on the bus, I will choose to either read a book that is challenging, or I will turn off everything. I mean, I'm on the bus for like 35 minutes, so it's not like the end of the world's going to happen in 35 minutes. So it's a good enough chunk of time for me where I can turn off everything without the world ending. And I'll actually try to say, okay, well, what kind of problem do I have at work right now? And I'm going to try to solve it. So maybe I can't figure out what that headline is going to be for the news release that I'm writing. I was having a hard time figuring out the headline, and I just basically left it. So then I'll sit on the bus and just quietly to myself in my mind try to walk through different options and realize what are the best options and why would that work and why wouldn't it work. And I think that that's actually been really good for me, because it's forcing me to concentrate. Even though it's only 35 minutes, it's really forcing me to concentrate. And the benefit is I'm actually solving a problem and I'm solving an issue. And when I'm done and I get off the bus, it's like, oh, well, I've got my headline now. I mean, I think you could, if you have the ability and the time to do what Ross is doing, I think that is awesome. And I wish I could do that. But if you are in a more, especially a media relations role where you're the main point person for media, and you constantly have to kind of be distracted because you kind of have to be checking your email on a regular basis, I still think there is a way to find that middle ground.
So, Christine, I will say that I'm not surprised at all about that your role, that you're saying that your role, in your role, you don't do deep work, because I had that job, but also your current role is all about delegation and project management for the most part, right? So you're constantly giving things to other people to accomplish and do deep work on, probably, and checking back on them and managing schedules and people. I'm not surprised. I do think that there are roles that don't necessarily require that sort of thoughtfulness and mindfulness on, a particular project. So I think there's definitely a time and place.
True. And although my role doesn't lend itself to some of the deep work that Cal Newport was talking about, like the long periods where it's like 3 hours, shut down, do nothing, it might not work for that. But I do believe, and I'm becoming more and more of a believer of this as I work through, the past couple of months and trying to do my exercise brain regime, there is still room for deep work. And it may not be 3-hour chunks, but it could just be simple, because maybe my problem is, it could be something to do with project management, or maybe there's like this issue that a project has run into and we've run into a dead wall, Finding that solution requires deep work, and that should be treated as deep work. It might not be physically sitting down and writing something, but I should be able to sit in a room quietly and say, I'm going to solve this, and use my brain to figure it out. So again, I think it's just different kinds of deep work, which is it kind of leads me into my next question. So how important do you think deep work is for career development? And when we talk about deep work in this scenario, when you're a student, I mean, you might be able to sit down for 1 or 2 hours, but if you've got school and you've got a part-time job and, you're doing a whole bunch of stuff, it might be hard to find 1 or 2 hours of deep work time. So in this case, deep work can also mean those shorter bursts of trying to solve a problem just using your mind. But Julia, let's start with you. How important do you think deep work is for career development?
For career development, I think it's very important. because I think that there are always things that you can be learning more about in a more thorough, and I'm trying to find a synonym for the word deep here, that you can go deeper with, right? So I think that at a surface level of, not doing any deep work in your career or in your role, I think you can maybe get comfortable or not challenge yourself as much. So I do think it's very important for career development. I'm not saying that it has to be a daily thing or a weekly thing, but definitely an occasional thing where you're really challenging yourself in those moments. So I would say yes.
Well, and I'd have to agree with you, and I think that just the act of exercising your brain, and I'll repeat this several times in the episode. This is one way that Cal Newport tries to equate it is, I'm a runner, so I put aside 2 times a week, Wednesday mornings when I work from home, I put the kid in the stroller and I go for a run. That's in my calendar, 8:30 a.m. every Wednesday morning, right? And then on the weekend, it depends on Saturday and Sunday, but I'll try to squeeze in a run somewhere and then. But kind of like what Ross does, right? I actually schedule physical exercise. And I think it's important from an early stage to actually schedule your deep work for your brain, because your brain is just as important as your body, right? And the more you can exercise your brain muscle, the more solutions you can come up with, the more your mind expands and learns and retains, and all of that is obviously great for career development. What about you, Claire? How important do you think it is for career development?
Well, what I thought about kind of this concept of deep work and just like focusing in for a few hours, I kept coming back to, I think it's Malcolm Gladwell and the 10,000 hours to kind of master something.
Yeah.
Because I kept thinking about it, and it makes sense. I mean, if you really want to get down to something, it's more effective to spend an hour doing it than to spend an hour jumping in and out from email and going back to it and going back to it. So it kind of makes sense whether you're doing it in 20-minute, 30-minute chunks, if you can set aside 4 hours, or if you want to spend an hour cooking pasta sauce on Sundays like Ross, it's all good. But that idea of slowly building up and kind of chunking away at those 10,000 hours, I think it's probably really good for your career development, because it forces you to think deeply, for lack of any creative language. It's rooting you in and gets you to think really holistically. You're digging into the work rather than just phoning it in. And I think spending that kind of focused hour or however long gets you more excited about what you're doing, and it shows in the final product, which is obviously helpful for your career when you want to put your best foot forward, especially at the beginning. And generally, it's a sign that you're wholly kind of committed to what you're doing, and it helps your career when it all kind of adds up, because it just keeps showing it. And I feel like it also reaffirms kind of your commitment for yourself mentally, if that makes any sense. But I just thought it's kind of like an interesting, like, picking apart the 10,000 hours by focusing on different times. So
yeah, that's a good way to think about it. What about you, Ross?
Yeah, I think to build off of what Claire was saying, the idea of deep work allowing you to get excited, to get energized, and to kind of really become great at what you do is where I see the biggest benefit from it. Like when I think about deep work, I think about taking a chunk of your time and allocating it to something that you know is challenging, something that you know you want to achieve. And by constantly doing that, you're going to eventually get better at it. So it goes back to that concept of the 10,000 hours. But more than that, it goes back to the idea that people's happiness comes from when they get into that state of flow. So when you're in that state of flow where you're working on something and you're crushing it and you're constantly seeing success from your efforts, that provides us with a little bit of internal happiness. So deep flow and deep work isn't just an opportunity to kind of develop your career, but it's also what I would consider like an internal well-being kind of thing. Like it can offer you with that personal internal satisfaction to know that you're becoming better at something. So many people get caught up in their day-to-day job and they don't like it and they don't enjoy it. But when you take some deep work and you focus on something and you start to see that you're improving, everybody loves growth. So when you see that you're growing because you're taking batches of your time to really become great at something, that's rewarding. Like that's one of the most rewarding feelings that we have in the world. So when you are able to do that and you see the results, it not only will allow you to develop in your career, but it will allow you to develop internally, personally, through your happiness and all of those types of things as well.
So I'm going to address basically everyone who's rolling their eyes up to this point, because even I rolled my eyes when I was listening to Cal Newport. And I think it is important for us because there are a lot of industries out there. And again, Cal Newport wasn't talking to communicators. He was talking to everyone and anyone, right? And there are certain professions where deep work works better or is easier to implement into your schedule than others. And I think communications, marketing, and public relations is one industry that it's very, very, very hard to integrate it in. So I kind of just want to talk a little bit about that and want to be honest and try to address this issue that communications is go, go, go. You're on call all the time. If you deal with media, you have to respond to them as soon as they call, because I know better than anyone, if you don't call the media within, the first half an hour that they've left you a message or sent you an email, you could have lost the story. And who knows if that was a big story, right? So how have you guys, and especially Racine, as you've gone to that point where you've been able to actually set aside this time, like, were there challenges and how did you overcome them? And how did you get to the point that you are now?
Yeah, so there's definitely challenges with it. And I think that to hijack a quote from Theodore Roosevelt that I go back to all the time, it's like, the idea is that nothing in the world is worth having unless it requires some pain, some effort, and some difficulty. And I really believe that even when it comes to deep work. Like, I don't care if you're in PR, if you're in communications, if you're the CEO of a company. I believe that deep work is important if you want to actually grow in your career. Like, I think we have to find time and we have to find opportunities within our work schedule to be focused on things. And I think that there are opportunities that we might ignore that allow us to kind of have a scapegoat to say, no, I don't have time to be someone who engages fully in my work for a little while, where you can actually delegate some time off. Like, if you go on vacation, your work doesn't like catch on fire, right? Like your job doesn't fall apart. Your company doesn't fall apart. What happens is people figure out a way to work around your schedule. So I think we need to be more intentional about communicating with the people who we work with to say, I don't work from this time to this time, or put on a out of office on our email that says, I'll be back at noon to respond to your emails, or I'm busy right now, but I'll get back to you within the next 3 hours. Like, you can hack your life to allow yourself to have that deep work. You just have to think creatively about it and ensure that you're allocating those times to things that are actually going to allow you to grow in your career and in your life.
I completely agree. And I think in your situation, Christine, where you are the primary media contact, I know what I would do would be I'd keep an eye on my email, but I would only open the emails that I knew were from media. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? So I would not allow those interruptions to come in. And I guess that's more of a self-policing sort of thing that's easier said than done. Mm-hmm. But, odds are on the one afternoon that you choose to, do some deep work, you're not going to get a, breaking news, the national phoning, or maybe Murphy's Law is that you do. But I would just keep an eye out. I mean, the names of the journalists, you can just keep an eye out for important stuff, and then just be really, really strict with yourself not to open anything else. But absolutely, I ignore emails in the phone when I'm in the middle of something really big all the time. It's the only way I can stay focused and really get stuff done. Yeah, I think it's essential. And I mean, other than to your point about the media, most things can wait. This is why, I mean, I've said this before on the podcast, I don't get people that, feel the need to answer every single email from their phone 5 minutes from when it came in. Like, I frankly, I think that's when mistakes are made, first of all. But yeah, I don't think anything's that urgent that it has to be dealt with immediately.
Yeah, I think as communicators, like I don't know anybody who's in marketing or in PR who has literally gotten an email and by them responding saved somebody's life. You guys might have, but like I don't know anyone. So because of that, like we need to chill out a little bit and like recognize like we're not doctors, we're not dealing with people who are in life or death scenarios. Like if you get a press release, it's not gonna change the world. So I think we just need to be humble and recognize like we're not dealing with life or death here.
Honestly, Ross has sounded like a self-help guru through this entire recording, and I love it. I am so down.
I feel like Ross is our resident guy that we pick on. Or at least I do.
This warm, fuzzy feeling inside, and I don't know what it is, but I'm really excited about it. Like, this is great. Oh my gosh. Oh.
So one more devil's advocate, and then we'll move on to the next segment. But so Ross, I completely get what you mean, and you're completely right. I mean, I think even if I were to wait like an hour before I responded to a journalist, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't lose all the stories. And on days where like the only time where a journalist won't wait for me to answer is on days that we actually came out with a press release. And on those days, I don't think I'd be choosing those days to be doing deep work because I have to be on call, right? So exactly. I get that, but I think the one thing that some of our listeners might have to might come up against is having a boss or superiors or colleagues who don't understand the importance of deep work. So I guess that's more of like the change management, right? I mean, when you come on board, I mean, it's one thing to be able to come on board and say, this is how I do things. Can you please respect me, right? But if you've been in in a career or you've been in your job for a while, I mean, anyone jump in with what you would think or any sort of advice that you might have for a young professional or a professional of any age for that matter, who wants to get into deep work and who knows that there's importance of deep work, but they don't get that respect from their colleagues. And when they put the out of office or they close their door, there's still someone banging on the door 30 minutes later saying, but I need to talk to you right now. Anyone have any advice?
Totally. I mean, I tried something similar, but I think it's just about communication. You have to be like, to appropriate people, guys, I'm trying this new thing. Where I, really focus and like dig down deep into something. And I had an outward invisible sign. This was a few jobs ago. I had an outward invisible sign of my big old Bose earphones. When those were on, I was not to be disturbed unless it was, as Ross explains, a life or death situation, which never happened. So that was an outward invisible sign. So maybe it's, closing your door, or maybe it's an out of office or whatever. But those headphones were my signal that I was in the zone and I was not to be disturbed. I have had lots and lots of colleagues say when their door is closed, it means do not disturb. When it's open, fair game. Now, I know we don't all have office doors, so that can't always be done. But, those are, if you need to do deep work, that's the perfect excuse to go down to the coffee shop or what have you, which I find really great. Like, you notice how I said I do deep work when I'm not around colleagues, not when I'm not in the office or not when I'm not around people, but when I'm not around colleagues is the key thing for me personally.
Now, from the perspective of someone who sits in newsrooms where you have no walls, no doors, no nothing, headphones, I totally back that up. It's like the universal symbol for don't talk to me, whether you're on public transit or sitting in front of people or anything. Headphones are huge. I think also if people ask you, explain it. I remember I had one instance where there was a really big article that had to get out by the end of the day, and it's, your editor's trying to juggle all these things, and he kept trying to ask me questions about a story that was the deadline was the next day. So that wasn't even my focus. I was trying to get this one written and ready and sent out and published. And at a certain point, I just turned to him and I said, that's not my priority right now. And it got to the point where it wasn't a confrontational thing, but I started writing out my priority on a notebook so that if he was curious about what I was working on at any given moment, all he needed to do was kind of look up over the table and he could kind of see and be like, oh, okay, she's on that. All right. And, and I had my headphones on, I'm working away, but kind of using those outward symbols. I know it sounds super passive aggressive, but if you have it kind of like written down what you're working on and you can just like show it to someone while you're still focused, I found it helped. And, people didn't take it as a weird thing. They just thought it was kind of quirky, but I got the job done. So
that's the important part, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You take a professional problem and you go for a walk. For some reason, it needs to be walking. This just works best. While you're walking, you try to make progress on the professional problem just in your head. So for example, I'll do writing in my head while doing productive meditation, trying to, how am I going to structure this piece? Or how am I going to structure this introduction? I can't get into it. Let me move the pieces. Or I'll work on a math proof in my head. Okay, how do I get to this result I'm trying to prove? Just like in mindfulness meditation, when you notice your attention wanders from the task and starts thinking about some email you need to write or whatever, you just notice it and you bring your attention back to the task. So you notice it, bring it back, notice it, bring it back. You do this for a month. You'll find when you first do it, if you've never done it before, your brain is everywhere. Just like when people are new to mindfulness meditation. You do it for a month and you realize, hey, now I can go an hour and a half on foot, keeping one thing in my head and actually making significant progress on it. So to me, that's like pull-ups for the brain.
All right, so it's time for our new segment that we started with our last episode called The Breakfast Club. In this segment, we share articles that you should read over breakfast tomorrow morning, or over breakfast, or maybe even during your deep work. You could read these articles during your deep work, get that brain working. So I'll kick it off with my article. It's an article from adweek.com. Adweek does like a good recap piece on Snapchat's new custom stories. The new feature, new, I guess this is a couple weeks old, but the feature lets users collaborate by posting their photos and videos to custom story threads. I'm actually curious. The reason why I actually brought this up is I'm curious from our audience and also just everyone on the podcast, if anyone's actually started using these and how do you like the custom stories? And I've also heard like the naysayers saying that like you're trying to copy whatever, Instagram or Facebook. And I mean, first of all, like just side note, all social networks always constantly copy and steal things from each other. So that's not anything new. But curious to know, has anyone actually started using these features and do they find any benefit in them?
I have watched them.
Me too.
I've been enjoying Instagram stories.
I've watched the Snapchat custom stories. I had about 4 or 5 friends who took a trip together and all added to the same thread. And it was interesting, I guess, but it was also weird because I just kept recurringly watching their stories again as I kept going through. So it felt a bit redundant, but maybe that's only because I knew everyone who was in the thread. Maybe it's more interesting if you don't know everyone.
That's interesting. Does anyone see, I guess when I first read this article, I was curious to know how a marketer would use this. I mean, I'm sure there's 1,000 ways that, marketers could use this, but for a user, it's great. Whatever, you get together and you have your own little group and you share kind of like, a trip or a birthday party or a wedding or whatever, any sort of unique thing that everyone can add to. But has anyone started thinking about how a marketer or communications person can use this?
Yeah, so the big thing at the end of the day is attention, right? So when we start to see more and more people watching these stories, there's opening up opportunities for advertisers to throw their ads in the mix. So if you're watching your friends at a Jay-Z concert and they see 4 snaps in a row, if they want to get to snap number 6, they have to watch my ad in between it. So it's disrupting the flow of the content on the story, but it's also the way that advertisers, I believe, are going to have an opportunity to kind of inject themselves into it.
Neat. Well, I'm excited about it. It's always nice to see sort of new evolving things on social media, and always like to bring it to our to this podcast and to our audience to kind of just see, the new stuff. Always, how are people using it, and not just personally, but also trying to figure out how we could use it in our industry. Who wants to go next?
Okay, so my article is from the Career Contessa, who is the founder is her name's Lauren McGoodwin, and she's an online career development and mentorship person for women specifically. But the latest article that I really liked from her, and I tweeted it out, is how to successfully ask for a raise in 5 steps. And this is something that I have done multiple times in my career successfully. And it is something that I have coached mentees and peers on how to do successfully too. And I think my memory is dwindling, but my memory literally seems to get worse by the week, I swear. I think we've talked about this before, Christine, haven't we?
About our memories?
Have we talked about how to ask for a raise, or have we have we talked about how to negotiate?
We may have mentioned it, but I don't know if we actually went through step by step in any of the podcasts. So, hey, new episode idea. We should actually sit down and give some advice on how to ask for a raise.
Well, okay. So to clarify, I was talking about we've talked about it on the podcast, not we've talked about it in our professional lives together.
No, I know that's what you meant. Yeah.
Okay, good. Clarifying. So anyways, this is a really great article, and it kind of makes it a little bit more succinct because I know a lot of people are really scared about asking for raises. And a lot of people just don't do it at all for that reason and can be at a company for, a decade without asking. So they break it down really simple. Do the research, make it official, script it, practice it again, leave your emotions at home, and accept that the answer might be no. And it's a 5-step process, and it's just so simple. And if you follow it, I'm sure you're going to be successful in getting a raise. So definitely a good piece to check out.
That's awesome. I think that's really great for our audience and definitely a good idea for a potential future episode. Claire, Ross, who wants to go next?
Sure, I'll jump in. So mine's from a old blog back in 2013, but I stumbled on it just recently. And when I did, I shared it on Twitter maybe like 5 times in a week, just with different quotes from it because there's so much gold in it. It's from a company, very boring company, traditional finance firm called Blackstone, but it's the founder, Byron Weens, discussing lessons learned over his 80 years of being in life. So he turned 80 and he wrote this blog post, and it was all about like some of the lessons that he learned in business, things like the value of networking. He talked about how when you meet someone new, treat that person as a friend. He talked about the importance of reading all the time, about getting enough sleep, traveling extensively. He talked about trying to find out about people, their lives before they turned 17. So what like experiences were formulaic in creating the person that they are today. So it was a great article. We can definitely include it in the show notes so people can check it out. But it was without question one of those articles that I bookmarked and I've read probably every month since I've seen it.
That's awesome. I'm excited to read that one.
Yeah.
And Claire, what's your article for the Breakfast Club?
So I've got a bit of a weird one this week, but I thought it was fascinating. It's a piece in The Atlantic called "So Where Are All Those Robots?" And it looks into the reasons why we, because we keep hearing about robots and they're taking over and people complain and there's all these incredible economic uses for them and there's a lot of breakthroughs supposedly happening, but we haven't actually watched it happen so much. Like, yes, there are that kind of technology is used in factories and certain things, but it's not a robot sitting at the front desk yet. So it's a story that looks into how people keep saying that robots are killing jobs when, and this is a quote, "The killer is nowhere to be seen and the supposed victim isn't even dead." So if you want a really interesting, fascinating, and beautifully written look into the future when it comes to robots in the tech industry, I really recommend this piece. Again, it's The Atlantic. It gives you kind of an odd sense of satisfaction knowing that the plot of The Terminator is still far from an imminent threat. It's really, really good. So.
Well, that's good news.
Yeah. End on a positive.
Yeah.
So if you guys ever want to have an episode about robots, I will debate all day that robots are going to take our jobs.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Young PR Pros. We would love to hear from you and hear how we did. You can email us at youngprpros@gmail.com. Check out our blog at youngprpros.ca. We're also on Facebook at Young PR Pros Podcast. And of course, Twitter at Young PR Pros. Thanks, and we'll talk to you next time. This episode featured tracks by Poddington Bear and Lee Rosevere. Soundwork and editing by Claire Bonnyman.